research the psychology of climate science denial, just trying to explore different ways of countering misinformation. But I actually started my career studying physics at the University of Queensland in Australia. The thing is, while I was doing my physics degree, I often would spend my spare time drawing cartoons. And so after I finished my degree and graduated, I took a fairly dramatic career shift and became a cartoonist. And so while I was drawing cartoons for a living, then I suddenly found that I was spending my spare time doing science. I started a website, Skeptical Science, which debunks misinformation about climate change, and gradually became more and more intrigued with all the psychological research into how to debunk misinformation. And so now I'm a social scientist working at George Mason, and I finally found a way to bring those two worlds together, art and science. So what I'm going to do today is explain the science of science denial using cartoons. So I research, as I said, how people think about climate change. And the answer is not very well. Our brains have evolved to deal with immediate dangers, a predator jumping out of a bush. And so we're not really equipped to deal with an issue like climate change. Climate change is abstract. It deals with a global problem spanning decades and going centuries into the future. And that's just not what our brains have evolved to deal with. So it should come as no surprise that a lot of people aren't really as concerned about climate change as the science is telling us we should be. Now, on top of all the psychological barriers to people fully grasping climate change, we're also being bombarded with a misinformation campaign. And this is probably the most well-funded misinformation campaign in human history. And so when you put together the polarisation, the psychological barriers, vested interests and lobbyists all contributing to this misinformation landscape, what we really have is a psychological perfect storm, making it really difficult for people to properly grasp the reality of climate change. But this veneer of controversy covers over the fact that the scientific case for human-caused global warming is actually built on over a century of research. And scientists have been spending the last few decades taking measurements, observing our climate, and trying to better understand what is driving the global warming that we've been going through over the last several centuries. And what they've done is they've looked at all the usual suspects, the most common drivers of climate change. So for example, there's solar activity, there's greenhouse gases like CO2, carbon dioxide, there's volcanic eruptions, there's internal variability like ocean cycles that move heat from the oceans to the atmosphere. They've looked at all these different drivers of climate change, and then they've looked at all the different patterns that is currently being observed in our climate system. And what they find is all the patterns that we observe match what you would expect to see if greenhouse gases were causing warming, and most of them rule out all the natural drivers of climate change. So let me give you a few examples. The top one there is winters warming faster than summers. This was a prediction actually made in the 1860s, at around the same time that the Civil War was being fought in the US. John Tyndall in the UK was running the first experiments demonstrating a greenhouse effect. And he predicted that if greenhouse gases were causing warming, one of the patterns we should see is winters warming faster than summers. It turns out that over the last few decades, that's exactly what we've been seeing. A 160 or so year-old prediction borne out by measurements. If we go down about halfway, I think there's one, 3 from the bottom, nights warming faster than days. This is another prediction that John Tyndall made. And again, that's what our scientists are observing now. All the patterns confirm that humans are causing global warming and rule out that, that natural causes must be causing climate change. Based on this this body of evidence, this consilience, all these different lines of evidence, we now have overwhelming consensus amongst climate scientists. So there's been a number of different studies that have tried to quantify the level of agreement amongst scientific experts. And as George very kindly said, I published a study finding 97% consensus. When our study came out in 2013, the thing that really surprised me was how surprised everyone was by my result, because we were not the first study to find 97% consensus. We weren't even the second. There was a study published in 2009 that found 97% consensus amongst climate scientists. Another study came out a year later that found exactly the same result. And then 3 years after that, we found 97% consensus. So there's been more studies since ours came out. But it's a real measure of the kind of challenge of communicating the science that I think it was Monday night or Tuesday night, Donald Trump gave an interview with the Associated Press where he said, well, there's scientists on both sides, basically saying that there was no consensus that humans are causing global warming. What he failed to mention was on one side, you have 97% agreement. On the other side, you have a vanishingly small minority. Yeah, it's a challenge. And so we have this scientific consensus, and the big irony and tragedy of climate change is that we used to have a political consensus as well. In the 1980s, the leader of the Republican Party, George H.W. Bush, campaigned on climate action. He pledged that he would fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. And somehow we've gone from the 1980s to this current situation, from a bipartisan, climate change being a bipartisan issue, to it now being polarised and completely partisan. How did we get there? The story begins back in the 1980s. And Naomi Oreskes has written a book, Merchants of Doubt, which tells this story thoroughly and really well. What happened was 3 scientists, physicists, and I'm not bagging on physicists because I come from a physics discipline, but 3 physicists started attacking certain scientific results. What they attacked was the science linking smoking to cancer, linking industrial activity to acid rain or ozone depletion, or fossil fuel burning to climate change. Basically, any scientific research that found that the industry was having either a negative effect on health or on the environment. And so the natural question to ask is why? Why were they doing this? Were they getting paid? Were they motivated by money? And it turns out that their motive went a lot deeper than just money. They were all believers in free, unregulated markets. They believe that industry should be free from government regulations. And if we started putting even small taxes on tobacco or just small regulations, that was just the start of a slippery slope, and eventually we would end up with government controlling every aspect of our lives. And so, therefore, they attacked any science that might lead to regulation of industry in any form. And so, yeah, the slippery slope fallacy was the real, I guess, flaw in their thinking and in their argument. Fred Singer was kind of like the 4th musketeer. He was like the 4th merchant of doubt that joined their group. Whoops, too far. And we should give credit where credit is due. While the merchants of doubt were attacking climate change and really starting the misinformation against climate change, they didn't invent these techniques. The pioneer of these merchants of doubt strategies was the tobacco industry. If anyone's watched Mad Men, you've seen this in action. Basically, any research linking smoking to health impacts was attacked by these merchants of doubt and others. And then they took those same strategies, even the same arguments, and even the same people, and started attacking environmental science as well. And this misinformation has been effective. We've seen over the last few decades that climate change has been getting more and more polarised. We've seen Democrats becoming more accepting of climate change, while Republicans have become less accepted. And it's got so polarized that now that there was actually a study published by some of my colleagues at the University of Queensland in Australia. They did a survey of surveys. They looked at all the different surveys into climate beliefs, and they found that the biggest driver of a person's attitudes about climate change wasn't their education level, it wasn't even their science literacy level, it wasn't their age, their gender, their income level, it was their political affiliation. People's attitudes about what's happening to our climate was determined by who they voted for. So that's a grim situation. And an interesting thing is in my work, working in climate misinformation, the people who deny the scientific consensus on climate change call themselves skeptics. And so I've been working in this area for a decade, and for me, the word skeptic had quite a negative connotation because it was equated to people denying science. And gradually I figured out that actually they had co-opted this term for themselves. But real, genuine scientific skepticism is a good thing. A skeptic considers the body of evidence first and then comes to a conclusion. And science denial is the polar opposite of that. A science denier has a conclusion first, they have their pre-existing position, and then they deny any scientific evidence that contradicts their position. Skepticism and denial, polar opposites. So how do you tell the difference between a skeptic and a denier in practice? What I found was a really useful framework were the 5 techniques of science denial. I think it was Mark Hoofnagel who first posted about these in a blog post, and then Pascal Diethelm wrote about them in a peer-reviewed paper. And a really easy way to remember the 5 characteristics or the 5 traits of science denial is the acronym FLIC. The first one is fake experts, using spokespeople who convey the impression of expertise but don't possess any actual relevant expertise. And in climate change, the most famous example of this is the Oregon Global Warming Petition Project, which is a website where anyone with a science degree can sign up to sign this statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. And when you look at this list of names, there's about 31,000 names, 99.9% of them don't have any expertise in climate science. It's anyone with a science degree, so it's people with like a computer science degree or medical science or veterinary science or mechanical engineering, but less than 0.1% of them have climate science expertise. The second technique of denial is logical fallacies. And this can be examples like using red herrings to distract people or using straw men to misrepresent an opponent's arguments. And the danger of logical fallacies is A, they can be quite difficult to spot, and B, they can be quite persuasive. And so I'm going to come back to this later on how you can identify fallacies in arguments and how to respond to them. The third technique of denial is impossible expectations. So this is a strategy that the tobacco industry perfected. They would demand ever higher levels of proof from the science before creating policy, acting on the science, as a way of basically delaying policy. We're seeing that exact same strategy with the EPA right now. The fourth technique in FLIC is cherry picking. When the full body of evidence tells a picture that you don't like, the only thing you can do is just cherry pick the bits of evidence that paint the picture you like and ignore everything else. And the last technique is conspiracy theories. So there was a great talk earlier today on conspiracy theories. If the whole global community of scientists are saying one thing and you believe something else, what are the alternatives? Either they're all accidentally wrong in the same direction, or they must be conspiring to deceive you for some reason. And inevitably, when people deny a scientific consensus, they end up believing in conspiracy theories. So why does this matter? Can't we just ignore denial? Can't we ignore misinformation? Can't we just communicate the science? It turns out that science tells us that no, we can't be in denial about science denial for a really important reason. Now, we tend to think misinformation is dangerous because it can make people believe wrong things, and that certainly is the case. But there's another more insidious and I think even more dangerous aspect of misinformation and fake news, and it's that when people are presented with conflicting pieces of information, fact and misinformation, often they don't know how to resolve which is true and which isn't, and that can just cause them to disengage from believing in facts at all. We've published research at George Mason University that found that when people are presented with a fact and a myth, they cancel each other out and they just end up, their belief doesn't change at all. So myths can cancel out facts. So this has a big consequence for science communicators and scientists and educators, because it means that even if we get our science communication fine-tuned just perfect, all that work can be undone by misinformation. So we do have to respond. So the challenge of misinformation is it's like those old Star Trek episodes where Captain Kirk gets cloned. Usually I'm talking to students. I'm really happy that I'm talking to a room which probably have seen a lot of these episodes. But so there's often these episodes where Captain Kirk gets cloned and Mr. Spock has to tell which is the real Kirk and which is the evil clone. And that's the conundrum that the public face when there's all these fake news and facts and real news and misinformation flying around. They don't know which is fact and which is fiction, and the real danger is that they disengage and just stop believing in facts. So that's the problem with misinformation, but understanding this dynamic also points to the solution. What we need to do is not only communicate the science to people, we also need to give them the tools to be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction. We need to help them see through the techniques of misinformation that mislead people. So basically what I'm talking about is something that psychologists call inoculation. So we talked about vaccination denial during this week. And with vaccination, what we're doing is exposing people to a weak form of a virus in order for them to build immunity so that when they encounter the actual virus, they don't get infected. Now, psychologists have found that exactly the same thing can happen with misinformation. Through over half a century of research, they found that when you expose people to a weak form of misinformation, they build up immunity. So when they encounter the actual misinformation, they don't get influenced by it. So what do I mean by a weak form of misinformation? Basically, it's like this slide. Explaining the techniques that misinformation use to mislead people helps people see through it. It's like explaining the sleight of hand that a magician employs when they're trying to trick people. Once people understand that sleight of hand, they can't not see it. And so when they see the magician do their trick, they can see that way that they're trying to just distract them and pull off their trick. And so that's really what we need to do when we're communicating science to the public. Not just communicate the science, but also communicate how that science can get distorted. So let me give you an example on how to do that. How do you put all this into practice? Here is an example of a climate myth spoken by Marco Rubio during the 2016 Republican primaries. And basically he's arguing that humans can't be causing climate change now because climate has always changed in the past. So is this a valid argument? If it isn't, what is the fallacy that he's committing here? And how would you explain that to people? The way to, I find, is a really powerful way to get to the heart of where an argument goes wrong is through critical thinking. And the beauty of critical thinking is it lets you, it's basically like X-ray vision into thinking. It allows you to take an argument, deconstruct it into all its starting assumptions or premises and its conclusion. And once you've deconstructed it into all of its individual parts, then you can surgically pinpoint exactly where the argument goes wrong. So in this case, Rubio is arguing climate is changing naturally in the past, climate is changing now, therefore it must be changing naturally now. And there's two ways that an argument can go wrong. Either one or more of the starting assumptions can be wrong, the premises might be incorrect in some way, or all the premises could be true, but the premises don't lead to the conclusion. In this case, this argument commits the fallacy of jumping to conclusions, otherwise known as a non-sequitur. Both premises are true, but they don't lead to the conclusion. Just because something was natural in the past doesn't mean that it has to be naturally caused now. But often arguments that are non-sequiturs have a hidden premise in them. And in this case, the hidden premise of this argument is that only natural processes can cause climate change. He's basically arguing climate change has happened naturally before, and climate can only change naturally, therefore what's happening now must be natural as well. What this third premise does is it commits the fallacy of, well, it commits the single cause fallacy, assuming that only one thing can cause climate change when human activity is another possible driver of climate. So having identified the fallacy in an argument, in a climate myth, in any form of misinformation, what's an effective way to communicate that to the public? In an ideal world, we can bring everyone, the whole public, into a classroom and give them a critical thinking course, teach them how to deconstruct arguments and give them the whole taxonomy of different logical fallacies. And we should aim for that. We should be getting more critical thinking into classrooms. But realistically, how do we respond to misinformation in the real world where we won't be able to achieve that kind of utopian goal? And what I found was a really powerful way to communicate how an argument goes wrong is through parallel arguments. Basically, what a parallel argument does is take the bad logic in a myth and transplant it into an absurd situation to show exactly how that argument is logically flawed. So here's an example of Marco Rubio's argument. The top half is verbatim what he said in the Republican debate. And the bottom half is an absurd situation, but using the exact same logic. Arguing that climate must be natural because it's always been natural is like arguing that people have always died of natural causes, so a murder victim with a big knife sticking out of their back must have also died of natural causes. Obviously the logic is ridiculous, but it's the exact same logic as Marco Rubio's argument. And so parallel arguments are a really elegant and entertaining way to explain to people bad logic. Let me give you another example of that, another parallel argument that shows the flaw in Marco Rubio's argument. Arguing that gravity doesn't exist because birds fly is committing a single cause fallacy. Obviously, gravity is not the only force that determines whether a bird stays in the air or not. And so when you commit fallacies like that, you can make dangerous decisions, like jumping off a cliff or withdrawing your country from the Paris Climate Agreement. So I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just give you maybe one or two examples of parallel arguments. Very quickly, like we currently have been experiencing warming over the last few decades. There's a long-term warming trend. But on the day after the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, Scott Pruitt from the White House argued that, well, actually, global warming stopped in the late 1990s. Now, when you have a long-term warming trend with lots of variations, basically you can pick any short period where it looks like global warming has stopped. So you could go through a whole global warming period and say, no, it's not warming, it's flat right now. Oh, it's flat right now, it's flat right now. And it's committing the fallacy of cherry picking. So what Pruitt is doing is basically equivalent to standing on the bow of a ship which is sinking and arguing, this ship isn't sinking. Actually, I'm moving upwards. I think I've got time for one more. This was a temperature map of the world in February 2015. 2015 was the hottest year on record. which it broke the previous hottest year, which was 2014, and then 2016 went on to beat that. And most of the world was really hot. But there was this one blue spot over North America, reaching right down to Washington, DC. In Washington, DC, in February 2015, Senator James Inhofe stood in Capitol Hill with a snowball and said, well, you scientists are saying that it's the hottest year on record, but I've got a snowball and it's very cold. That's equivalent to the sun setting, it getting dark, and arguing, well, I'm not seeing the sun, so the sun mustn't exist. Actually, one more. Indulge me one more. Most of global warming is going to the oceans. This is the total amount of heat building up in our climate system. Over 90% of it is building up in the oceans. The oceans are building up heat at a rate of around 250 trillion joules per second, which is equivalent to 4 atomic bombs worth of heat every second. That's how much heat is building up in our climate system. Heat in the oceans is fuel for storms. As storms or hurricanes pass over the ocean surface, they scoop up this heat and it creates more energetic, more intense storms. And so when we look at hurricane intensity, over the last few decades, since the late 1980s, hurricanes have been getting more intense. But just this week, President Trump argued that because we've had hurricanes in the past, humans can't be influencing hurricanes right now. That's equivalent to arguing that because people have died of cancer in the past, before cigarettes weren't invented, therefore cigarettes can't be causing cancer now. It's the same logic. And just to finish off, if you want to dig deeper into these ideas, we have a massive open online course, a free course, which just launched last week. It runs till February at the sks.to/denial101x. The course's title is Making Sense of Climate Science Denial, and we debunk 50 of the most common myths about climate change. It's a fantastic resource. There's dozens of videos, short 7-minute videos. And secondly, if you're interested in seeing more cartoon parallel arguments, just go to my Instagram page. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.